Welcome to In But Not Of, a podcast dedicated to applying a Christian worldview to the study of history and culture. We're so glad that you could join us today. Hello, everyone. I'm glad you can join us today for part 2 of our look at Jordan Peterson and some of the statements that he's made recently. Certainly, we've looked at statements that he's made from 2019 and beyond. And today, what I want to do in part 2 is kind of get up closer to the present in terms of what he said about belief in God and things like that. Just to review really quickly, Peterson is a clinical psychologist from the University of Toronto, taught at Harvard University, but really is famous because of his books and his podcasts, and certainly is an insightful individual whose views in many cases line up with biblical values. So he has created quite a stir. He's pushed back on cancel culture to some degree. He's really talked about the importance of freedom of speech. So he's a polarizing figure, as you can imagine, in today's climate. And so last time we were together, we looked at his answers to the question of what does it mean to, when someone asked him, do you believe in God? Now, his first response that we addressed last time was it's none of your business. And it wasn't really his response. He's saying that he's tempted to answer these in several different ways. And he basically brings up 3 different ways that he answers the question. So the first one, and our purpose in looking at this is because I think his answers are the ones that he says he's tempted to answer in that way, is typically the way people respond to these questions. As you've shared your faith and you've gone out and you've kind of talk to people about their religious views, it's not surprising that these types of responses come up. And none of your business is a common one. And we looked at that last time and maybe what undergirds that, where that comes from, how that started. And then the second one that we dealt with at the end of the podcast was his answer, what do you mean by belief? So Jordan Peterson will ask people to clarify their terms. If you ask me if I believe in God, that depends on what you mean by belief. And he talked a lot about what his assumptions were in terms of belief. What does it mean to say that you're a believer? And I do want to pick up with that to start because I think there's some more things that needs to be said about that. He's he's hypothetical in kind of his answers, so it's hard to know exactly clearly what he is saying it means to be a believer, but just in the way that he kind of articulates himself, at least to some degree, it seems like he buys into this idea that saying you're a believer in God pretty much entails some form of moral purity and or perfection, even if it's to a certain degree. And I think what's lurking here is he's afraid to use that term because of the baggage that comes with it. And he's very well aware as he looks in the mirror and he looks at his life that this, he's not morally pure or perfect, as we all know that we're not. And so I think he's struggling and he's wrestling with that too. And I think last time we also talked about the idea that he has spent a lot of time teaching lessons from the Old Testament. So that metaphorical kind of, approach to the Old Testament is there too. Not that all of that is wrong. There's certainly key lessons that we can learn from Old Testament figures. But I'm not convinced just by hearing what he said that he is certainly a believer in biblical inerrancy. Now, in some sense, Peterson has also taken those to task in some of his comments for not living up to the standard that they claim. Now, last time we talked about the idea that Jesus, of course, did the same thing with the Pharisees and with individuals that he talked to, and rightly calling to account people who say they do one thing when actually they do another. But we also talked about that there's a misconception here too, that when someone says they're a believer, that they're actually doing this in the spirit of self-righteousness. The central focus of the Bible and Jesus's message is the opposite of that, that coming to the conclusion that you have blown it consistently throughout your life and you're in need of a savior is what actually is a big part of being a Christian. And of course, it's Christ's imputed righteousness to us that makes us righteous. It's an alien righteousness. It's not a righteousness that we have in and of ourselves or in our ability to do the right thing. So I think that, of course, needs definitely some clarification and some further conversation as far as Peterson is concerned with his beliefs. Now, the other thing, and obviously God is the one who judges because he sees our heart. So a big part of morality, of course, is your intention and your motive in doing what you do. Ethical theories from all over the place will talk about that. And God is the one who sees the heart, and he is the one who will ultimately judge. But we are called to protect the rest of the flock at times from the sinful actions of individuals or institutions. That is something that's demanded of us. Now, Peterson in other places rightly points out the problem with pedophilia and moral and sexual misconduct of those in positions of power. And we see people that are sometimes, very remorseful when they're caught, or even institutions when they recognize that they have an issue with some sort of sexual misconduct. Of course, we've seen this with the Catholic Church and at times with the Protestant Church as well. But we see that people either personally or institutionally, while they say they're sorry, do little to nothing to actually change their behavior. Now, this should cause outrage in and out of the church. And I think this is what Peterson talks about many times when he struggles or hesitates to call himself a believer because of, I guess, our reactions when we hear of these things. And when you think of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, this essentially was his very point. And it's the point also where Jesus says that not all who say they are believers actually are, and in fact, may be in the church doing the devil's work, doing our enemy's work, the wheat and the tares. And I think this is why church discipline is so important. Discipline and punishment, for instance, not necessarily the same things. And that's a whole other podcast to unpack the difference between those two. But it's often viewed as very negative, right? And demeaning and vengeful. When, as a matter of fact, a biblical understanding of discipline is quite the opposite of that. And I mentioned ecclesiastical structure because I think that's important too. So when you look at institutions, for instance, that are largely controlled by one individual or a certain personality, and that personality were to falter or to fall, and then you see the institution or the body go with it, well, that's very, very disturbing. Because I think that when you look in the pages of the New Testament, and you look at the way the church was designed in terms of leadership, I think the New Testament clearly shows a plurality of elders. And that is, of course, there's tremendous wisdom in that, because then the body is not at the mercy of that perhaps that personality that feeds into sometimes that consumer mentality where we go to hear the personality that we like the best. Where when you have a plurality of elders with multiple giftings, that seems to be a much healthier way in terms of the leadership structure in a church. And we also see that when that's the case, and you have that accountability, somebody doesn't rise so high above everybody else that they're kind of on an island by themselves, which is a very scary place to be. And so I think Peterson has seen a lot of this. And I think that another helpful insight that he makes, and in some of the things I'm bringing up, I played you a brief clip last podcast, and I'll play you a second clip today that's from 2021. But one of the things that he also talks about in that clip, he talks about the value of having an honest spouse. And the value in that spouse, not just agreeing with everything you do. He actually says, kind of throwing rose petals in your path as you walk, but actually a spouse who pushes you. And I like the way he says this, pushes you to who you could be rather than who you are. The idea that your spouse actually pushes up against you or pushes back at you because that individual cares about you and your future and is interested in bringing you to the place and to the fulfillment of who you could be rather than just leaving you as you are. And I think when you think of discipline, whether it's holding somebody else accountable in your life or having those difficult conversations, many times it's a cop-out to not do that. And it's a matter of selfishness. You don't want to run the risk perhaps of being unpopular with that person. I don't know if unpopularity really applies to one individual, but you don't want to be disliked. You don't want to lose a friendship. You don't want to lose maybe somebody that has common interests with you. So the easier thing is to just not say anything, not to push that person to be their best. Not, and I think sometimes we get caught up too. We don't want to do that because we don't want somebody else to think we're self-righteous, nor do we want somebody else looking at us and inviting that type of accountability into our lives, right? Because of its unpleasantness. But I think if we're going to be honest, when we step outside of our feelings and emotions at the moment, it's really what we want. That's why so many of us tend to do hard things. We want the discipline that's required. We want to make the sacrifices that would be required to achieve some sort of goal. But this idea of discipline is the concept of ironing, sharpening iron, iron sharpening iron. And this is really the purpose of, in many cases, church discipline. It's protecting the flock, and actually it's protecting the individual in a sense from themselves. If we genuinely care about people, that means that we will push them to be who they could be. I think we have to be careful in how we do this. And I think it's, something that we certainly need to pray about and seek wisdom. And I don't think we always do it in the same way with people in our lives, but I think he's really onto something there. And, sometimes when I'm a public school teacher, and I get frustrated because I see one of the things that's happened is discipline is really defined in a negative way. And so when a child or a student, and I teach high schoolers, and when discipline is about to take place, many times I have people around me, whether it's just in the education world in general, or principals or superintendents, or people that kind of make policy, will always go back to the person's background and struggles, and perhaps if there's some sort of background that they have that isn't as there may be some hurt back there, or a reason that they act out, or the reason that they do. So they get so focused on that, it basically cripples them when they go to actually instill discipline in that individual's life. But really, if the discipline is correct, and if it's done in the right way, it's really the best thing you could do for that student. And instead, what happens is we have this bigotry of low expectations. Well, they've got such a bad background. This isn't going to change. We just need to make them feel good. Well, we know enough about human nature, I hope, to know that is a dead end road. And certainly many of us can look back at our own lives and see, where that didn't work. And I think there needs to be a healthy balance there. Obviously, we do need to care about people's backgrounds and things like that. But we're way on the other side of it, at least in the public school world. Now, that brings us to Peterson's third response, his most recent response, anyways. And I think this will give us also something to think about. So I will pick this up about a minute or so into his interview, and this is what he has to say about whether or not this is his third response, in a sense, to the question of, do you believe in God?
You can debate about whether or not he actually lived and whether there's credible objective evidence for that, but it doesn't matter in some sense because it does, but there's a sense in which it doesn't matter because there's still a historical story. And so what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived, plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that, but I'm amazed at my own belief and I don't understand it. Because I've seen sometimes the objective world and the narrative world touch. That's Jungian synchronicity. And I've seen that many times in my own life. And so in some sense, I believe it's undeniable. We have a narrative sense of the world. For me, that's been the world of morality. That's the world that tells us how to act. It's real. We treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world. but the narrative and the objective world touch. And the ultimate example of that in principle is supposed to be Christ. But I don't know what to, that seems to me oddly plausible.
Yeah.
But I still don't know what to make of it. It's too, partly because it's too terrifying a reality to fully believe. I don't even know what would happen to you if you fully believed it.
If you believed in the story of Christ, or if you believed that history and let's say the narrative meet,
both, I think you, because when you believe that, you buy both those stories. You believe that the narrative and the objective can actually touch.
Yeah.
Okay. So quite quite an emotional moment, actually, as Jordan Peterson comes to that kind of his third response. Now, he's said it a little more succinctly in other places where he said, I'm afraid that it might be true. And here he kind of says that again. Now, leading up to this, he in 2019, which is where our last podcast kind of dealt with his comments concerning the first two responses that he had. He also had an interview with Dennis Prager, where he kind of I think the name of that interview was "My God, or something like that. And he talks about his understanding of key biblical principles, and you still see some of that ambiguity. And I think there's ambiguity here, actually, when this is a much more emotional and in some ways direct response to the question, but there's still a bit of ambiguity here. And one of the things that happens is, as you listen to him, if you remember from the last podcast, we talked about the three aspects of faith. And the idea here that the first two aspects, which we talked about the content of faith. There's, you believe the content of faith. Then there's the assent to that content. You acknowledge that that content is true, so you actually believe it. This answer here, though, centers on the third part of the aspect of faith, which is fiducia, which is the commitment, the actual embracement of it, the actual trusting in that personally and intimately. Now, I think that the emotion that he displays in this clip is evidence of him grasping the magnitude of what this means. And I'll go further. I think that it could mean, maybe, that Jordan Peterson is in the process of grasping the third aspect of faith known as fiducia. Now, I believe that is a gift from God, that faith and the grace that allows that to come into our lives it comes from God. And as an outsider, we, again, not only do we not know somebody's heart, but we don't know exactly whether this is a case of that or not. But we look at evidence, right? The Bible instructs us to do that. We look at fruit in people's lives. It's scary to us because we have certainly if you're like me, you've seen some very gifted individuals in the rock and roll world, for instance, who have had alleged conversions. I think of Bob Dylan, for instance. He had a whole album that he came out with dedicated to the Christian faith. I remember Hank Williams Jr. as well. Chris Christopherson. There's a lot of artists and famous people who have professed faith in Christ, and it ended up seeming like it was a phase they went through. The behavior after that certainly didn't live up to what they had said at the moment or that period of time, or their emphasis that their careers and their lives took. But the other thing that he says here is he says this is too terrifying to believe. And I also would argue that by him getting choked up, I think that his tears reveal other emotions besides terror. And there seems to be something deep going on here. And one of the things when he says, this idea that I fear that it might be true, one of the things that's happened to Jordan Peterson is he has struggled with addiction in the last year. Now, this was to a medication that was designed to help him deal with anxiety. There was other personal things going on in his life with people being sick around him. So, but one of the things that addiction does is it makes it real clear to you, anyways, what slavery really is. It helps you, it helps you to internalize and understand what it feels like to be enslaved to something. For those of you that have experienced that, you know what I'm talking about. This helplessness, it's very hard to really maintain, self-righteousness and some of these other things when you've been an addict. And so he seems, this is coming out the other side of that now. And I think there's a humility there that would be in any one of our lives. Now, of course, the Bible talks about us in sin, that whatever we do, okay, like when we're sinners, we are actually, the Bible speaks of us as slaves. We're enslaved to sin. When we become Christians, the language throughout the New Testament talks about us being free, being freed from the power and enslavement of sin. So in a sense, Jordan Peterson, as he's getting choked up, and we know what the last year of his life has looked like, he is at a point, at least in his life, where this gospel really can penetrate. And I think that's why there's so much buzz about this, because we understand the tremendous gifts that this individual has. The compassion that he shows at times. He's got this reputation for being biting and direct, but the more you listen to him, you see that he's firm in his convictions, but he also he searches. I think that there's an honest reflection on things at times. He he has a tremendous amount of common sense, but there's also this grasping that he does for the divine, for the things that are beyond the world, in a sense. Now, here he talks about where the narrative and the objective world come together. Now, he's not using these words, but think of the Word. You read the first chapter of the Gospel of John, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Is that not the narrative and the objective world coming together in a sense? I don't want to go too far with that, but it seems to me a pretty good description of a certain way of describing it. And so he's, the other thing he says, he's like, I'm not really sure what would happen if I truly, totally entrusted to that, well, the answer that we know is you'd become a born again believer in Christ. That's what would happen. A full embracement of that comes from a gift from God himself. But those of us who have experienced that know the magnitude of that. And I think the refreshing thing here is, unlike, periods of church history where we've seen, kind of a gospel message that's watered down, where it pretty much says, hey, bring Christ or bring this identity as a Christian along with everything else you believe. Make it, like we said last time, in its own little compartment. We can baptize your life with Christian language. You're in charge. You set your goals and all the rest of it, and we'll bring God along for the ride. Well, his emotions here don't seem to reflect that this watered down version of the gospel is what he understands. Again, not a lot to go on here, but he does seem to grasp the power of the reality and the truth of the gospel, if it were true, what it would mean. So this is kind of, at least as far as I know, like there's other videos out there where he's talking about other things. I think this will come up time and time again. So we have to be careful to not make too much of this. But at the same time, we have an individual here that is struggling, at least with what seems to be an honest struggle of the magnitude of who Christ is and who he claimed to be. And, I don't know what the future holds for Jordan Peterson, but God does. And I think his tremendous gifts and insight into human nature are a gift from God and a product of his grace. And in closing today, I just want to say, let's pray that God's saving grace would become manifest in Jordan Peterson's life as well. Well, that's all we have time for today, friends. But remember that all truth is God's truth. And if Jesus is who he says he is, then that changes everything. We hope you enjoyed being with us today. Join us each week for In But Not Of, a podcast dedicated to applying a Christian worldview to the study of history and culture.